All right, everyone, welcome back. So for this lecture, I am going to talk a little bit about what is called the Lavender Scare. So this was the particular ways that the LGBTQ community was persecuted during the Cold War. It is discussed in the textbook, but I'm going to go into a little more detail in this lecture. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And then we will begin. All right. So this cover that you see here is the it says the interim report of one of the committees, the congressional committees that was assigned to root out communism in the United States during the Cold War. And it refers specifically to this association between what they called homosexuality with communism. And so the effort to root out communism was also linked to the effort to root out homosexuality among those who worked for the federal government. So we're going to talk more about that report in a minute, but I wanted to give you a little bit of kind of context for what leads up to this. So during World War II, homosexuality and another note on terms. Homosexuality is not really a term that we use today. We have found better terms. But this was definitely what the term that was used at the time. And that's why I am using it for this era. But at the time, that was considered a mental illness. And if you were diagnosed with a mental illness, you could not serve in the armed services. And this was one of the questions that the military would ask you if you enlisted to serve during World War II and before World War II. Another thing that happened during World War II was new strategies, these efforts to kind of get rid of people who were suspected of being homosexual. And initially, the way to do this often was to use sodomy laws. Now, sodomy laws had existed for over hundreds of years before this moment. There were sodomy laws in various states that existed all the way until about 2003. So sodomy laws have their own long history. They refer usually to particular sexual acts. So some sodomy laws were specifically against oral sex or anal sex or other forms of other behaviors, sexual acts that were considered deviant. And often these laws did not explicitly name that the person who was charged with committing that act they didn't talk about that person's sexual orientation, but the targets were usually people who were suspected of being homosexual. So sodomy laws was a common way of persecuting LGBTQ folks long before the war. But during this war, there was a new kind of offense that they used. It was called a Section 8 blue discharge. And this is what they started to do, was identify people as psychopaths. So there's a shift here, right, between a kind of persecution based on an act, a sexual act that is labeled as deviant, and this turns into a kind of a label of a severe mental illness, and that's a kind of increasing emphasis during and after this time. It's also important to note, though, that in spite of all of this persecution, during World War II, some historians have called this kind of a national coming out experience, because so many people started to to have the freedom to have relationships with people of their same gender, people who they fell in love with. And it's because, you know, they moved around when they served in the military, or when they went to the cities to work in defense industries. Often these were, you know, segregated by gender, and they were leaving the kind of small towns where they grew up, so they were free from the kind of watching eyes of their families and family friends, and they were more anonymous, you know, in these urban areas, and that gave them the kind of freedom to pursue relationships with people of the same sex and people who they fell in love with. So the other thing to note is that even within the military, there was a kind of subculture that developed. There were drag shows. There was a whole kind of lexicon. The writings of Dorothy Parker kind of inspired this. There was a queer newspaper, you know, called the Myrtle Beach Bitch, among other titles. And and all of this had to be in secret, but it was a really it's a kind of vibrant secret sort of subculture that thrived in the service. And after the war, a lot of people, you know, stayed in these cities because that's where they found this greater safety and this greater freedom. And so it's after the war that you start to see this emergent kind of LGBTQ political identity forming. And we'll kind of get back to that at the end of this talk. But the other thing to keep in mind is that this is after the war that this is published, but a lot of these studies were kind of initiated in the decade before this. So Alfred Kinsey was really interested in studying human sexuality. He wasn't initially that particularly interested in orientation, but he wanted to know how diverse and varied people's sexual experiences were. And so he and his team interviewed thousands of men and women. And the first study that was published in 1948, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, became a bestseller. In about 4 years later, there was a study about women that was published. Both of these become kind of widely talked about and discussed in American society, because these reports really challenged what Americans, at least publicly, talked about in terms of sexuality. That really there was an incredible variety of feelings and attractions and behaviors that Americans experienced. And these were in these kind of long interviews where people really gave these kind of honest accounts. And so what they did develop, though, was this new kind of scale, the 0 to 6 rating scale, with an additional category of X. And what they said is, you know, for some folks, they reported kind of exclusively being attracted to and having relationships with people of the opposite sex. So that was kind of a 0. And then other people who were kind of all the way on the other end of the spectrum of the 6, that they were only had experiences or attractions to people of the same sex. But there are lots of folks that were kind of in the middle, you know, people that reported early sexual experiences with people of the same sex, but then they married someone of the opposite sex and were attracted to people of the opposite sex, or vice versa, right? You know, this great variety of feelings and experiences that what you couldn't put in this simple kind of binary. And they also had this category of X, which was people that reported no kind of feelings or relationships, sexual relationships at all. Probably the category that we might kind of call asexual today. So this report really just kind of, you know, blew people's minds at the time. It was sort of like this revelation that we're much more complex sexual beings than any kind of public document had ever acknowledged. Unfortunately, though, you know, when this comes out, instead of fostering greater acceptance and tolerance for this kind of diversity, there's actually increased persecution of people who kind of go against the kind of heterosexual norm. And so at the same time as these studies are being published, you see this increased persecution of LGBTQ folks. So some examples: 1947, the police initiated what they called a sex perversion elimination program. So they would go, to parks, and they would go to establishments that were kind of known to attract gay customers, and they would arrest people and they would intimidate people. And a year later, Congress passes an act called for the treatment of sexual psychopaths. So this helps facilitate this persecution, right? They can now have more authority to go punish people and label them as mentally ill. Also, when people were arrested, their names and their pictures were often published in the newspapers, so they could lose their jobs, they could be ostracized by family and friends. Really, really painful repercussions of these targets. And sometimes people would try to avoid that by, they wouldn't use their real names when they go to these establishments. But unfortunately, it didn't always work. And so people were often lost a great deal in these continual raids. So, and this of course kind of comes at the time when there is growing kind of anti-communist sentiment and hysteria. And Joseph McCarthy, when he speaks to Congress in February of 1950, he named several cases of suspected communists, but two of the cases also, he says, are people who he labels as homosexual: case 14 and case 62. And he says that from what he has heard from intelligence officials, that that communists are kind of twisted mentally or physically. And so it's this sort of idea that that these two identities kind of often kind of come together. And the other argument was that people who were labeled as homosexual were seen as security risks, that they would be more vulnerable to communist infiltration because they could be blackmailed. Because if a person found out that you were a so-called homosexual, then they could say, well, you need to go along with us, or we're going to reveal your identity. And so they could be blackmailed and could undermine, could find secret government documents, so they could be kind of compromised. The irony of all this, of course, is that if this had been an environment where people where gay men and lesbian women were not persecuted, of course, they would not be supposedly so vulnerable to being compromised, right? So there's a little irony in the way that was used. But the other reality was that there wasn't really any evidence that people who were kind of suspected and ousted for being homosexual, that they were of any greater security risk than anyone else. But these two categories become kind of both labeled as deviant, right? They talked about communists and homosexuals in the same way. They said they were morally weak, they were psychologically disturbed, they undermined American values of the traditional family, and they also were seeking recruits, right? That was the idea, was that they were trying to kind of grow their numbers. So that's how this kind of becomes integrated into the broader anti-communist movement. So the first set of hearings they have is called the Wary Hill hearings and investigation. This was March through May of 1950. And Senator Kenneth Wary and Senator Lister Hill. And they questioned, and in the previous slide, it's revealed that one government official said, that they had fired 91 people from the State Department as suspected of being homosexuals. So now this investigation looks into it and says, well, did any of these people get hired back? And the CSC determines, yes, some of them had been rehired. So now they recommended steps for removing them and also ensuring that anybody who was fired for being homosexual would not get rehired, right? And kind of a more vigorous process of getting people to disclose why they were let go. So real kind of violations of privacy here, essentially. And then there is an even wider investigation called the Hoey Committee investigation in the summer of 1950. And they interview government officials, law enforcement officials, and most of them are saying, yes, they'll say, oh, how many people they removed for being homosexual. They said they don't have any tolerance for homosexuality in their departments, all of this. They also interview medical professionals, and the investigators, they kind of want these kind of simple answers, and they want this simple kind of process for identifying homosexuals. So they are asking these psychiatrists mainly, can homosexuals be detected through an examination? Can it be cured? Do they lack the emotional stability for government service? And do they seduce younger men and women? They kind of want to know, can we figure this out, and can we root these people out? And are they kind of, are they guilty of these things that they've been associated with? And a lot of people in the medical community say, well, their answer in some is kind of like, it's complicated. It's not that simple. You need, one of the committee asks, like, can you get a quick test? Like, can you get an X-ray that we can figure this out? And they said, no, you need these kind of long interviews. And a lot of them are also saying that, it's not this kind of simple thing, that there are, as it says here, shades and gradations. And this kind of goes back to some of the Kinsey findings, right? They're sort of, some psychiatrists are kind of exploring this more and sort of saying, well, what is a quote unquote homosexual? What does that mean? And who is a homosexual? Who's a heterosexual? This chart here is one example. Captain George Rains, he taught at Georgetown, and he taught this to his psychiatry students. And you can see here that he's sort of talking about this kind of, again, these sort of categories, these sort of personalities he's associating with heterosexuality and homosexuality. And up here you see the quote unquote normal heterosexual, no experiences after 18 to 20, except under exceptional circumstances. Now, I'm very curious about what those exceptional circumstances would be, but this sort of, in some ways, it's somewhat similar to the kind of Kinsey scale, to the occasional homosexual, to the bisexual, to the overt homosexual. So those are kind of these kind of gradients at the top. Now, the ones at the bottom are ones that are more linked. He kind of links them more to various other, what he defines as other kind of pathologies or illnesses. So there's the supernormal, people who are completely intolerant to homosexuality, and they would slug a person if they were propositioned or approached. So a kind of violent kind of reaction. The alcoholics, people who are kind of overtly homosexual when they're drunk, essentially. And then people who are kind of paranoid or schizophrenic and have these kind of delusional responses. And so you see, even here, even though there's some kind of acknowledgement of some complexity, this chart is also really associating homosexuality with deviance and with mental illness. And so the real stigma is definitely still here. So the report generally found that they detected about 5,000 people who they accused of being homosexuals in military and civilian workforces. they concluded without reservation that gay people should not be employed by the federal government, that they were a security risk. All of those things of lacking emotional stability and being of a weak moral fiber, it reaffirmed that. And this was through kind of selective evidence of the findings. So there are archives that have all of the testimony, and the testimony gives a more kind of varied picture. There are some officials that express greater tolerance or kind of hesitations, and medical professionals kind of noting the complexity, but all of this is kind of ignored in the final report. And these investigations had a devastating impact on the LGBTQ community. So historians estimate 5,000 to tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs, and had trouble getting new jobs, and some of them committed suicide. This was a highly influential report. It came to influence a number of, government manuals for embassies across the world. And most significantly, as it says here, it helped institutionalize what later would become President Eisenhower's 1953 executive order that explicitly named sexuality as a criteria used to determine suitability for federal employment. So this explicitly bans LGBTQ folks from all jobs with the federal government, which at the time is the largest employer in the country. So it is a devastating kind of persecution. There was resistance among federal employees who lost their jobs or who were persecuted for this. One prominent example, 1957, when Franklin Kemeny was fired, he took his case all the way to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, he lost it there. But he went on to found a branch of the Mattachine Society in Washington, D.C. You can see him in this image. He's the second person from the front, and you see these demonstrations of people that are advocating for LGBTQ rights, that are challenging their persecution in the late 50s. In spite of this very oppressive kind of environment. And it's not until 1975, though, that the Civil Service Commission announces new rules and kind of essentially overturns that 1953 policy. So you can no longer bar a person from federal employment because of their sexuality. But it takes a really, really long time for this to happen. And I want to say just a little bit more about resistance movements, though. You have during this time two really important organizations, the Mattachine Society, which was created in Los Angeles in 1950 by Harry Hay and other leftist leaders. This actually is kind of these are communists actually who are forming the Mattachine Society. They take the term Mattachine from, it was a kind of medieval French term from these male dancers who kind of satirized the normal conventions. And they kept it secret. The leadership in particular was anonymous. They didn't want, because that was for to protect the privacy of the members. They published their own review here for many years. And this became one of the, it grew to many branches across cities, and became very influential for later gay rights movements that would follow. And women, the Daughters of Bilitis was another lesbian centered organization founded in San Francisco in 1955. And this was also to kind of create an organization that was kind of an alternative to the bars. And they formed their own publication, The Ladder. You see this image of this woman sort of removing the mask. That was kind of a symbol of kind of, being who you are, removing the kind of mask that you have to kind of live under. And that publication went on all the way to 1972. And this is also a kind of obscure, the name is kind of obscure. Right? Bilitis was a Greek character who was associated with the female poet, Greek poet Sappho. So both of these organizations, they don't label themselves overtly as gay rights organizations because it's obviously not very safe to do so. And they also kind of talked about themselves as social clubs rather than as political movements. So sometimes later generations would kind of challenge that; they would become more overtly political. But keep in mind that at the time that this was still a pretty radical moves, and it was ways that LGBTQ folks just found kind of solidarity and kind of community with each other at a time when they were so widely persecuted. So later we'll take up, kind of the next generation of gay rights movements, but this tells you a little bit about how this played out during the Cold War.